For being one of the most influential villains in Disney's history, Maleficent was never really given a strong backstory, and a lot of fans have been left wondering why the Mistress of Evil became that way. However, after reading through the novel Mistress of All Evil: A Tale of the Dark Fairy by Serena Valentino, it's clear that it wasn't entirely her fault. In fact, Maleficent might have made for a very strong and very good fairy had it not been for Aurora's three fairy guardians, Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather. Before being treated poorly simply because of the way that she looked, it appears that Maleficent was on the path to becoming a fairy that could have helped people one day. According to the fourth installment of Serena Valentino's Disney Villains book series, there was a lot more to the Dark Fairy's history than her simply waking up one day and deciding to be evil. And in her telling of the story, Maleficent was basically forced into her position of evil after being tormented and essentially typecast at her school, or maybe even her whole life, depending on how you look at it. The book itself bounces back and forth through time in order to recount Maleficent's childhood all of the way through the days after Aurora fell into her deep sleep, which helped create an accurate image of Maleficent's origin while also putting a spotlight on the true villains of the story, the three fairies. According to Serena's book, the evil fairy's story started when she was a small child that lived in fairylands. Only, unlike the other fairies, Maleficent didn't have any family. Instead, she was shown living in a tree with a murder of crows, and to make matters worse, no one in Fairyland would even speak to the young child solely because of how different she looked. In fact, it's even explained that her name was derived from Saturn due to its perceived unfavorable influence, and Mars because Mars was seen as a malicious god. And with an origin that dark for just her name, it was clear that Maleficent wasn't going to have a good time growing up. Her only saving grace in the book came when the young fairy was discovered by Nanny, a seemingly strong fairy that also happened to be the head mistress of the Fairy Academy, and after meeting Maleficent and seeing the future Dark Fairy's magical prowess, decided to adopt Maleficent, which would end up being one of the few acts of kindness that Maleficent would ever get to experience. Sadly, it's Maleficent's childhood with Nanny that set her up to run into three particular fairies that Disney tried to paint as good fairies, but were shown as being nothing short of evil toward Maleficent. It turns out that there was a side to Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather that Disney didn't show us that may have been responsible for creating the villainous Maleficent that everyone knows her to be. In Disney's Sleeping Beauty, the three fairies were depicted as the good fairies and were given the clear task of watching over Princess Aurora. They were first introduced at baby Aurora's christening, where they each offered a gift to the newborn princess, though Merryweather's gift ended up being used to weaken the death curse that Maleficent placed on the child. From that point on, the three fairies were shown as nothing but kind and spent the next 16 years watching over Aurora in order to keep her safe. But what Disney didn't tell us was Maleficent's malice toward Aurora was ultimately caused by Fauna, Flora, and Merryweather and the way that they treated the Dark Fairy during their childhood. The trio first met Maleficent at the Fairy Academy after Nanny enrolled her. You see, according to the book, Mistress of All Evil, after Nanny took Maleficent back to her home as a child, she began teaching her how to use magic. And after seeing how talented the young fairy was, Nanny decided that she would enroll in the Fairy Academy, which wasn't difficult to do since Nanny was the head mistress. Now, in the book, the way the Fairy Academy was described seemed really cool and sort of like Hogwarts, but sadly was full of bullies that didn't like anyone who was perceived as different, something that Valentino's book showed us Maleficent definitely was. The future Dark Fairy was ridiculed by many of her classmates who tended to single her out for her horns and dark outward appearance. Even Cinderella's fairy godmother appeared in the book as Maleficent's teacher and adoptive aunt, and much like the rest of the fairies at the Academy, she was shown to be cruel. It was stated that Fairy Godmother had wished that Nanny would have just left Maleficent in the tree with the crows, but the three classmates that bullied Maleficent the worst were the three supposedly good fairies from Sleeping Beauty, and in the novel they showed their true colors. In Serena Valentino's book, she depicted Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather as if they were the true villains with the way that they treated their new classmate. They called Maleficent mean names, and they even told her that she needed to hide her horns. Little did they realize that they were shaping one of the greatest villains in Disney history. Unlike the rude and snarky fairies at the Academy, Nanny was the only one in the book who truly understood Maleficent's potential, and she even began teaching her how to use magic that wasn't taught at the Academy. And when Nanny realized that Maleficent had already outgrown the Academy, she decided to pull her adopted daughter out of the school and finish teaching her magic on her own. And while this may have helped Maleficent get away from Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather, it wasn't the last time that they sank their cruel metaphorical teeth into her. Maleficent ran into the three fairies sometime later at the fairy exams, where, if it weren't for the good fairies, she would have become a protective wishing fairy much like Fairy Godmother was. In the fourth installment of the Disney Villains series, after she learned various forms of magic, both light and dark, Maleficent expressed a desire to take the fairy exams, and though Nanny was hesitant at first, she eventually allowed the young fairy to pursue her dreams. The exams were held on Maleficent's 16th birthday, and during the exam, each fairy was assigned a person to protect, which would then determine whether or not they were ready to go out and do that on their own. Interestingly enough, the future evil fairy was assigned Snow White. In the book, it was revealed that Maleficent was the one who helped Snow destroy the evil queen's mirror, and in doing so, Maleficent technically passed the fairy exams. However, when Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather weren't as successful, they took their anger out on Maleficent and sent her directly down the path of evil that Disney showed her take in Sleeping Beauty. According to Valentino's novel, the three fairies accused Maleficent of making them fail after being tricked by a shape-shifting enchantress that transformed into Maleficent and sabotaged the trio. So, after their exam, Flora, Merryweather, and Fauna approached Maleficent and very rudely accused her of being evil and sabotaging their opportunity to be real fairies. And by that point in the book, Maleficent was tired of being looked down upon, especially since she was aware of how powerful she was compared to her classmates. So at that moment, Maleficent let out all of her anger and hatred that she had bottled up from years of being ridiculed by her own kind for simply looking a bit different. She transformed into her dragon form and went on a destructive rampage as she attacked the fairies that surrounded her. And in the chaos, Maleficent believed that she had accidentally killed Nanny, the one fairy that had shown her any kindness, and in doing that, her heart broke. Maleficent, who was still in her dragon form, was stricken with grief and fled the scene, though she chose to remain in her dragon form for years after. Had that been the end of it, Maleficent still might have had a chance at redemption. Sadly, this wasn't the last time that the three fairies' horrible deeds would cause Maleficent to lean toward her villainous side. In fact, the events that were shown at the beginning of Sleeping Beauty were directly caused by Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather neglecting Maleficent. As the movie showed us, King Stefan and Queen Leia were celebrating the birth of their daughter with a christening, during which it seemed like everyone was invited. Everyone but Maleficent. And when she showed up, the movie showed her as the bad guy in the scene, though her casting a death curse on the baby didn't really help her case. But if you take the information from Serena Valentino's novel into account, it's clear to see why Maleficent was so offended. The three fairies had neglected to invite her to her own daughter's christening. You see, in Mistress of All Evil, after living as a dragon, Maleficent eventually turned back into her fairy form, and eventually she reunited with the Odd Sisters, who convinced her to use a spell to create a child of her own. In doing so, Maleficent created Aurora, though she quickly realized that she could never learn to love the child, so she ended up giving it to the king and queen to care for. That showed readers that even though Maleficent wasn't good by any means, she hadn't completely given in to her evil side. If she had, she would have just left the baby for dead. But instead, she gave the child to a royal family in the hopes of her living a good life. But when Maleficent heard that the three fairies that used to torment her at the academy were going to be watching over Aurora, she was not very happy. And then to find out that she wasn't even invited to her own daughter's party, but Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather were, was what eventually set Maleficent over the top. And as the Disney film showed us, the now evil fairy then went full dark side and crashed the party specifically to put a curse on her own child. Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather had taken everything good away from Maleficent, so it's no wonder that she would want to take anything that could be considered good away from everyone else. What do you think about Maleficent's backstory according to Serena Valentino? It kind of paints a new picture of Aurora's three fairies, doesn't it? Let us know what you think in the comments below.